I sometimes hear someone whistling in my house. I live with my parents and my brother. No pets. My brother whistles all the time, but there are times when I'm home alone and I still hear the whistling. Also, my Google has gone off before playing old jazz type music, which no one in my house listens to. The other day, I was in the basement with my mom watching a movie. My brother and dad were out. When Google randomly goes off upstairs, saying, "I'm sorry, I'm not able to verify your voice." No one was upstairs. I don't even know what it could have been. It's not like the movie was super loud, so it picked up the voices. But it clearly heard something, though. By the way, my friend says he has a gift and can sense things. Apparently he says there's a spirit in my house of an older gentleman and a white dog. For context, I live about 30 minutes out of the city in a wooded area. Our closest neighbors are about 2 to 3 miles down the road, so I don't have an explanation for this. Last night, I was woken up by my dog crying at the back door. I looked at the time and it was about 3:30 a.m. I think to myself, that's weird, as he never needs to be let out at this time. I get up, turn on the porch lights, and let him out. He was hesitant to go out when I opened the door, which is also weird for him. I watch as he runs over to the back fence and starts barking. This wasn't his normal bark. He basically sounded and looked like Cujo from the Stephen King novel. Alarmed, as I've never seen him that distressed, I open the door and call out to him to come back inside. That is when I hear it. Whistling. It sounded like someone was whistling a song. I didn't see anything at this point, but it still freaked me out because I'm not sure who would be on my property at this time, or at all really. I'm desperately trying to get him to come in, but he's fixated on whatever he's barking at. I ran to the kitchen to grab his treats, hoping to bribe him inside. I come back to the door, and I hear someone or something barking back at my dog, but in a high-pitched voice. It sounded like when a human imitates a dog barking. I looked in the direction the noise was coming from, and can barely make out what looked like glowing eyes staring out of the forest. The whistling started again for a moment, and soon after, as I shook his treats and called out to him, I hear a very loud and deep growl. Not from my dog. It didn't sound human either. That noise sounded like a very mad, very large animal or something. My dog comes running in the door, straight past me and his treats, right into his crate. I slammed the door and locked it. I brought him into my room with me and barricaded us there until daylight. I could reason the growling to be a bear or mountain lion, but what was the whistling and the human-like barking? I'm not sure what that was, but it was enough to scare my dog to the point where he was trembling and panting. He's a German Shepherd, and he's a big, brave boy. I've never seen him that upset. I too am terrified, and hope that never happens again. This happened a few weeks ago. I went on a camping trip with some families in California, a campsite called Ice House. I've always rolled solo. My siblings and cousins are all in relationships, so I have a tent to myself. This was about 3 days into camping. It was maybe around 10 to 11 p.m., and everyone was dead asleep. I was just on my phone watching TikTok when I started hearing footsteps around my tent. I thought it was one of my family members, so I said, "Fuck you," and then what had sounded like literal footsteps stopped. I unzipped my tent window and looked at the direction the steps were coming from, but no one was there. Personally, I'm not a huge believer in the paranormal or ghosts. I shrugged it off and thought it was an animal. The next night, everyone was partying and drinking. I went to the forest to take a leak. From the corner of my eyes, I saw someone standing behind me. I quickly turned around and there was a man standing by one of the trees. I'd say he was about 10 feet away from me. He looked to me like a hiker with a huge backpack, but it was late at night. I ran. I didn't even think about looking back. I ran to my dad and I told him. He grabs his shotgun. We all as a group go to look for this man, but we couldn't find him. So my dad called a ranger the next morning and reported the incident. The ranger's exact words were, "We have had a lot of paranormal activities in this exact area." Chills down my spine. But he also said he didn't know if anyone had passed away here. We packed up and moved to an area where there were a lot of people so we would feel safer. To this day, I just think about if it was an actual person or if it was a ghost. Overall, this made me a 100% believer. Seeing the face of a ghost is scary because they don't blink. I don't know why, but after this encounter, I can't even sleep anymore. I guess I'm still spooked about it. This took place in Georgia 14 years ago. A group of friends and I were hanging out and eating pizza on top of our friend's car when we all saw what looked like a monkey swinging high in the trees a good distance away. I joked that one of the apes from the local zoo must have escaped, but there was an uneasy feeling and everything was quiet. It was a warm Georgia day, and we lived in an area with a lot of water surrounding us, so there were lots of insects, but everything felt quiet and still. The ape, or whatever it was, stopped swinging from the trees, and even though it was a really large, dark figure, we could tell it was looking at us. Then, the figure started straightening its posture, looking more human and less like a primate. It was unsettling. We all just stood, frozen, watching. Suddenly, the man seemed to turn around and crouch down, but as he was crouching, his shoulder blades were getting impossibly larger, growing over his head before huge wings sprang out of nowhere from its back. It then jumped off the branch and flew away. Even from a distance, we could tell this thing was huge. At that moment, it was like the spell we were under broke, and we all scrambled to get back into the car, screaming. I didn't sleep that night. I felt like whatever it was had followed me home and was watching all night. I'm sure that wasn't the case, but I was terrified. I wouldn't have believed it had it not been for the other 3 people that also saw it. I've had quite a few paranormal experiences, but that's by far one of the most terrifying and memorable ones. One night, when I was maybe 19 or 20, I had an encounter on the Blue Line train in LA that still haunts me to this day. I was waitressing in downtown Long Beach and worked the closing shift, so I was on the train around midnight heading towards LA. I'm a female. It was just me and a man on the train car. I had my headset on, minding my own business, and he was sitting in front of me with his hood up. Everything was fine until we neared Watts, California. The man got up, walked to the train doors, and as they opened, he turned to look back at me. That's when I saw it. He had no face, no eyes, no lips, no mouth, no features, just pure blackness under the hood. He walked off the train, and I felt like my heart almost fell out of my body. 20 years later, I'm still trying to figure out what I saw. I'm a 24-year-old female now, and this event happened in high school, maybe 10th grade, so I was around 15 at the time. I still remember what happened vividly. My friends and I went to a party of one of our classmates in a not so good neighborhood. This is kind of relevant because it could explain what we saw. The area where this took place is known to be of low income and drug infested. Immediately when we pulled into the neighborhood, we all felt that the vibe was off. Now this area isn't necessarily unsafe, just rural, dark, and unsettling. Anyways, we attended this party. I feel the need to state that we were drinking, but no one was necessarily intoxicated, maybe a little tipsy. We decided after a little while to leave and we packed into my friend's car. I remember how freaked out we were just driving through the neighborhood, but no one could necessarily explain why. We thought we were just freaked out by the dark. We pulled up to a stop sign, and suddenly, out of literally nowhere, a woman seemingly materialized on the sidewalk to the right of us walking her dog. This was around 2 in the morning. We looked over to see if she was going to cross the street in front of us since she was facing our direction, but her face was expressionless. Then suddenly, she lifts her right foot about 90 degrees in the air as if to take a large step off the sidewalk towards our car. She then opens her mouth and fully unhinges her jaw. Before she could even take the step toward the car, my friend floored the gas. We didn't even turn around to see if she was still there. We all slept on the basement couch together that night because we were terrified. Either she was on hard drugs or we saw something supernatural. Either option is equally as creepy. I moved out of my parents' house right after high school. My first place was a very old Victorian house that had been turned into a 2-family home. I had the entire downstairs to myself and a neighbor upstairs who was gone. The first night I was there, I hosted a party. Not like a full-blown rager, but some friends to come grill and have some beers. Needless to say, I ended up with a sink full of dishes. I laid my head down to sleep, thinking, man, my first night in my own place. 10 seconds later, I hear all the dishes in my sink start to rattle, like someone was shaking my entire sink. And then I hear sprinting footsteps up and down the hallway. I was convinced I was being robbed. I grabbed a bat and waited. This went on for about 10 minutes, and then it stopped. Eventually, I got the courage to go out to my kitchen, and it looked as if nothing had been touched. Not a single broken dish. 3 weeks later, I'm laying in bed with my girlfriend at the time. She wakes me up in a panic and tells me there is essentially a glowing white and gray woman standing 3 feet away from me. I didn't turn around to see, but she was convinced. She put her head on my chest and we just froze. I felt her look up and I asked, "Is it still there?" To which she said, "Yeah." And about 10 seconds later, it was gone. Nothing else happened after that. I lived in that house for 3 more years, but those first 3 weeks were absolutely insane. This happened in July of 2020. Me and my wife were on our honeymoon in Miramar Beach, Florida. On our last night there, I woke up to see an older lady in white with long gray hair staring at me from the exit door. She was about 70 to 80 years old, maybe 5'4", and was very wet. I could see the water dripping off of her hair. I closed my eyes and opened them again, and she was gone. All of a sudden, I feel a pressure on my back, like someone's jumped on me. I then feel cold, wet hair on the back of my head and neck. I'm a police officer, so I always have a gun by my nightstand. I grab it and make a sweep of the room. No one was there. I was so shook up we got our stuff and left right then and there. This is the only time I've really ever discussed it with anyone other than my wife. This is a second-hand experience from one of my cousins. Every summer, me and my family would travel a long way to visit my dad's family in Cebu, the Philippines. I was quite close with my grandpa. He was a gentle and lively man. But years ago, he was diagnosed with heart disease and became bedridden, to the point where he had to use a wheelchair to move around. He passed away a few months after that, and it really sucked. A few years later, my older cousin was looking for my grandma to tell her that dinner was ready. She went to the living room and saw my grandpa sitting on his old rocking chair watching TV, holding the remote and switching through the channels. The most unsettling part about this story, according to my cousin, was that Grandpa's neck was missing, like it had been severed. His head was floating a couple of inches above his body. Grandpa then turns around to look at my cousin, smiles, and says, "Oh, is dinner ready? I'll head down now." Then he stood up and walked towards the hall. My cousin ran away, screaming. I have no idea what to think, but I don't think my grandfather would hurt anyone. This story takes place in a very remote wooded area in northern Sweden. At the time, I was about 15 years old. Me and my cousin's family were staying in our summer cabin. The cabin is located on a hill, and at the bottom of this hill there's a lake with a wooden bridge and 2 boats. The property is surrounded by a dense forest, so the only thing you could really see when looking out of the window is the hill leading down to the lake and boats. It was maybe 9 p.m. when me, my dad, sister, and a few cousins decided to light a fire down by the lake. My grandparents, my aunt, and mom decided not to go because it was getting late. We just wanted to look out at the lake, stargaze, and chat. We brought our grandparents and our cousin's dog out with us. We walked down to the lake, lit the fire, and started talking. After about an hour, the conversation had fizzled out, but it was a nice silence. Suddenly, I started feeling a bit off and couldn't shake the feeling of being watched from the woods. We were sitting with our backs facing the woods and the cabin. The feeling was unsettling, but I tried thinking about other things when out of nowhere my dad just says, "Yes, I'm good." Everyone turned to look at my dad in confusion since there was no conversation taking place. Dad looks back at the cabin and then at my cousin who was sitting next to him, and he says, "Yeah, I'm doing good." "What?" My cousin responded, confused. "You asked me how I was doing, so I answered," Dad said. "I didn't ask you anything," my cousin replied. Dad looked confused and then said that he had felt someone lean over and whisper in his ear, "Hello, how are you?" He described feeling whatever it was breathing on his neck, and it put a hand on his shoulder. He thought it was my mom at first and turned around, but didn't see anything. Right after explaining this, the 2 dogs that were with us started growling loudly while looking behind where my dad was sitting, towards the woods. We all freaked out, put out the fire, and started running towards the cabin. Yeah, we haven't gone outside the cabin after dark ever since, and it's a memory that I'll never forget. But whatever it was nice enough to ask how Dad was doing, so I don't think it had bad intentions. The only thing I can think of is a Swedish nature spirit called Vitra that plays tricks on people, but according to some, it can burn down buildings or capture people if they are bothering them. However, they aren't really known for being nice, so who knows.